All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank the Elbaum Mishpacha for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Jerry Elbaum, Yaakov couple, Ben Avram Menachem, loving father of Avron, Sean, Judah Elbaum, and loving husband of Shirley Elbaum. May his memory be a blessing and remain eternal in our hearts. Truly beautiful. And to thank you to Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 9th yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, that Hashem will have an aliyah and the family ein nechama. We thank all of our sponsors for their generosity and for their dedication. With that, let us begin. So Baruch Hashem, we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Nun Hey 55. We are picking up on Nun Dalet on the base. We're just going to pick up again at the Gemara, because we left off a couple of lines into it, but just for the sake of clarity, we'll begin with the Gemara. We're going to be a little bit go a little bit quickly today, Meretz Hashem, to pick up some pace, but Meretz Hashem will see some incredible sugyas. So remember again, the Mishnah on Nun Dalet Amud Beis spoke about the concept of malacha on Tisha B'Av, and explained that whether or not one does malacha on Tisha B'Av seems to be a matter of minhag. But yet the Gemara said, in all places, Talmidei Chachamim do not do malacha on Tisha B'Av, and Rabbi Shimon said a person should make himself into a Talmid Chacham. Good. So says the Gemara as follows. Says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, Ein Tainis Sibur Bebavel, Ela Tisha B'Av Bilvad. So Shmuel said, there is no Tainis Sibur, there are no public fast days in Bavel except for Tisha B'Av. So we explained this yesterday, that the Tainis Sibur, the public fast days to which the Gemara refers, are fast days which were declared because of a lack of rain. But in Bavel, Baruch Hashem, there had other problems, but there were no problems with rain. Plenty of rainfall. The only, therefore, public fast day that existed in Bavel was Tisha B'Av. L'meimra, the Savar Shmuel Tesbav Ben Hashmash Shala. So Nabosai, and here's what's interesting. A Tainis Tzibur, interestingly enough, has its own. Remember, those of you who are with us from Maseches Tainis in the last cycle, and Hashem we'll get back to it, not even so far from now. So we'll see that in Meretz Hashem, that actually we'll see this in today's daf as well. There were 6 fast days, a total of 6 potential fast days over rain. They were split up into 2 groups of 3. The first one, each of them possessing different levels of severity. We'll actually touch on this a little bit today. But one of the interesting things about a Tainis Sibur for rain is that the fast day would begin the night before, but it would even go into Ben Hashmashas. So in other words, the fast day would begin at Ben Hashmashas. Now that's so pretty much, which we'll say just for our purposes, means, pretty much close to Shkia, right? At sunset, because again, there's a whole lot we saw, remember again from our days in Brachas, there's a whole discussion regarding when exactly Ben Hashmashas is, and what exactly the status of Ben Hashmashas is, but the idea the Gemara is saying is that by calling Tisha B'Av a Tainis Tzibur, that would indicate that Ben Hashmashas is Asr as well. It says the Shmuel really hold that. Shmuel Tisha B'Av Ben Hashmashas mutter, but Shmuel said Ben Hashmashas really only starts at Seis. Ben Hashmashas is going to be mutter. Maybe Shmuel holds in general that by a Tainis Sibur public fast day Ben Hashmashas is mutter. It's not true. Tonight we learned Ochlin v'shosimi ba'od yom. You're allowed to go ahead and eat and drink while it's still day. L'mi'utei mai. Now, what does that come to exclude? In other words, what part of the day does that come to exclude from the Tainis? Lav l'mi'utei ben hashmashas. It must come to exclude ben hashmashas, to tell you that a fast day, a Tainis Sibur, only begins at Seis, not the ben hashmashas. Lo l'mi'utei ben shechashecha. No, it actually comes to exclude anything before nightfall. Let's support this idea. In ben Tisha B'Av l'yom HaKippurim. Ela shazeh sveiko aser vezeh sveiko moter. It's very interesting because the Brisa says over here there is no distinction between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur except Safek. Safek Yom Kippur is aser, Safek Tisha B'Av is muter. Now what does that mean? So interestingly enough, it's a little bit of machlokes. Rashi tells us over here. So Rashi says what it means is sveiko literally means, let's say you're not sure which day it is. Right? You don't know what day, right? Now, so therefore you'd have to observe 2 days of Yom Kippur, because it's Safek Daraisa L'Chumra. Now, I will say, we happen to know the Gemara explicitly discusses this, right? Because this is an obvious problem. We keep 2 days of Yom Tiv outside of Chutz La'aretz. So if that's the case, in reality, why don't we keep 2 days of Yom Kippur? Right? It would make sense. To which the Gemara already says, impossible. You can't do that. You just can't do that. That is not a gzera. That's essentially a gzera she'en tzibur yachal la'amad ba. That's legislation that the general populace cannot sustain. So interestingly enough, so Rashi seems to see that's what it's saying. Tosfos, interestingly enough, says it's talking about a different kind of case, where a person is traveling, they get lost. Remember again, we saw this case. We saw this in Masechah Shabbos regarding Shabbos. Let's say a person is traveling and they lose track of time. So when Shabbos? So we'll say, remember we had a machlokes. What was the machlokes, remember? Right? Do you say today Shabbos and then count off from there, or do you count off 7 and then make the 7th day Shabbos? So we find like the latter opinion, you count 7 days and then count Shabbos. If you're traveling, you're lost, Tosfos says, and you don't know which day is Yom Kippur, so you'd have to keep 2 days. Tosfos posits from that. Okay, so the Gemara says, "My sveiko mutter." So what does it mean that sofek is mutter? So by Tisha B'av, lav ben hashmashos. Does that not come to include that halacha lemaisa? Actually, I got a little bit ahead of myself. So what does it mean, sveiko mutter? What does it mean ultimately that the suffix of Tisha B'av is mutter? Does that not mean ben hashmashos? Because ben hashmashos is suffix yom, suffix laila. The calendar. But that's what I was mentioning before. Rashi says over here, So we'll say, so that's what I'm saying. Rashi over here says, what it means is, if you're not sure about when Beis was Mekadesh the Chodesh, technically speaking, you'd have to keep 2 days of Yom Kippur. Tosfos says that's not true. That's why Tosfos posits that it's talking about the case of a guy who gets lost in the desert and has lost track of time. We'll say, so therefore, technically speaking, let's just put it this way. On a technical level, there is a potential situation where you'd have to keep 2 days of Yom Kippur. But even if you had some level of date or calendrical ambiguity, you would never have to keep 2 days of Tisha B'av. For a very simple reason. Tisha B'av, as significant as it is D'Rabbanan. It's D'Rabbanan. Good. Darash Rava. Rava darshan the following. Ubros, umenikos, misanos umashlim. We'll say pregnant women, nursing women fast, and they complete the entire fast of Tisha B'av. In the same way that they fast the entire day of Yom Kippur. Uben hashmosha shelo aser, and ben hashmosha of Tisha B'av is aser. Right? That Tisha B'av already begins essentially at sunset, because once you get to ben hashmosha, we don't know the status of ben hashmosha will be aser. And so they said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say here, the Gemara is being a bit more explicit, that halacha l'maisa, Tisha B'av, the fast already begins. Well, I'll say it as ben hashmashos of the day before. You understand what I mean by that? So, for example, if Tisha B'av is Thursday, so ultimately, again, it really starts ben hashmashos of Wednesday night. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Vam Rabbi Yochanan, Tisha B'av eino k'tainis sibor. Tisha B'av is, so Rabbi Yochanan says, Tisha B'av is not like a tainis sibor. My love ben hashmashos. Is when he says it's not like a Tainis Tzibur, is he not coming to talk about Ben Hashmashos? That whereas a Tainis Tzibur, a public communal fast day, begins Ben Hashmashos the night before, Tisha B'av perhaps does not, Tisha B'av maybe doesn't begin until Tzeis. To which the Gemara says, lo malacha. No, rather it means from malacha. So malacha, tanina. We already learned about malacha. Makom shenagu lasas malacha b'tisha osin. Makom shenagu shalasas malacha osin. So we'll say, so again, remember, we spoke about malacha in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah clearly indicated that the prohibition to do malacha on Tisha B'av is clearly a matter of minhag. And even Rabbi Yochanan even Rabbi who said that everyone should conduct themselves like a Talmid Chacham and not do malacha on Tisha B'av. That's only because there's no we'll talk about this in just a bit, but there's no mechse kiyura, there's no arrogance in refraining from engaging in work on Tisha B'av. It doesn't look like you're trying to make yourself like a Talmid Chacham. But again, is no Isser involved in Malacha. There's no Isser. Ela mai ino k'tainis sibur. Rather, I will say, what does it mean when the Brisa says that Tisha B'av is not like a tainis sibur? So we'll say, so we're kind of playing this both sides. On one hand, we're saying Tisha B'av is like a tainis sibur. How so? Just like a tainis sibur, a public or communal fast day, begins at Ben Hashmashos, we'll call it at dusk, the night before, so too Tisha B'av will begin at Ben Hashmashos. But yet we're saying now that Tisha B'av is not like Ben Hashmashos. So what does that mean? To which the Gemara says, Elo, Ella, ma'ina kitana sibor, letfilas ne'ilah. Rather, I will say what it means is, whereas this is actually fascinating, we are only accustomed to the concept of ne'ilah by Yom Kippur. But in fact, ne'ilah was recited by a Tainus Sibur as well. So in Eretz Yisrael, when they had a fast day for rain, the day would end off with the tefillah of ne'ilah. Quite incredible. When the Gemara says that Tisha B'Av is not like a Tainus Sibur, there is no ne'ilah by Tisha B'Av. No ne'ilah by Tisha B'Av. So the Gemara says, but why isn't there ne'ilah by Tisha B'Av? After Rabbi Yochanan said, halavai, a person should daven the entire day. I will say that's taken from Mesechas Berachas. Or actually, the Gemara is talking about the concept of tashlumin, of makeup tfilos. Okay, so the Gemara says rather what it means is hasam chova hacharashus. By a Tainus Sibur, there is an obligation to go ahead and daven ne'ilah. By Tisha B'Av, if you want to daven ne'ilah, you can, but ultimately, again, there is definitely no obligation to do so. The other passage is, what does it mean? It's not like, what does it mean that Tisha B'Av is not like a Tainus Sibur? So the Gemara says, li esrim va'arba. What it means is for the 24 brachas. That whereas on a Tainus Sibur, you daven a Shmona Esrei with an extra 6 brachas, that's for a Tainus Sibur. Tisha B'Av does not have anything like that. Whereas it's true that Tisha B'Av has the insertion of a paragraph of Nachem, but there is no additional bracha. Rav Papa Amar Ma'ino K'Tainus Sibur. Rav Papa says, what does it mean that it's not like a Tainus Sibur? It's not like the first 3, but rather it's like the second 3. I both say, what does that mean? Is going back to what I mentioned before. The first, remember, you have a maximum of 6 communal fast days for rain in Eretz Yisrael. The first 3 do not begin at Ben Hashmashos. The last 3 do. Because remember again, the fast days essentially escalate in severity. They go up in severity. The longer there is no rain, the more severe the fast in Eretz Yisrael, the more severe the need in Eretz Yisrael. So interesting, the Gemara is suggesting, when it says that Tisha B'Av is not like a Tainus Sibur, it means Tisha B'Av is not like the first 3. But it's like the last 3 in that it begins at Ben Hashmashas. Incredible. So I'll say, so just where the Gemara is holding right now, is Tisha B'Av is like a Tainus Sibur and not like a Tainus Sibur. It's like a Tainus Sibur in that what? It begins at Ben Hashmashas. It's not like a Tainus Sibur in that there is no Ne'ilah, there is no 24 Bracha Shmona Esrei. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Meisvei in Bein, both say second wide line, Nun Dal Amud Beis. Meisvei in Bein Tisha B'Av Le'Yom Kippurim Ela Shezeh Sveiko Aser V'Zeh Sveiko Moter. We learned in the Brayso there is no distinction between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, except that by Yom Kippur Safek is Aser, by Tisha B'Av Safek is Moter. My Sveiko Moter Lav Ben Hashmashos. So what does it mean Safek? Does Safek not refer to Ben Hashmashos? And maybe what it's saying is whereas Yom Kippur Ben Hashmashos is Aser Tisha B'Av, whereas by Yom Kippur, Ben Hashmashos will be Aser. By Tisha B'Av it will be Mutter. To which the Gemara says, Amar Shisha Reid Rabidi Lo L'Kviyah Diarcha. No, rather we'll say what it means is calendrical ambiguity, calendrical suffix, that in a technical level you could find a situation where you're not sure what date it is, which would then trigger an obligation to keep 2 days of Yom Kippur. Again, Machlokes Rashi tells us, as we saw before, exactly when that applies, but such a situation would never come up by Tisha B'Av. By Tisha B'Av, there's no such thing as calendrical ambiguity. In other words, you fast when you think is the right day, but there would never be an obligation for 2 days of Tisha B'Av. But for everything else, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are the same. This supports Rabbi Eliezer. Asr l'oli adam sheyoshit etzbo b'mayim b'Tisha B'Av keder she'asr l'hoshvit etzbo b'Yom Kippurim. Rabbi Eliezer says it is prohibited for a person to go ahead and put his finger in water on Tisha B'Av, the same way that it is asr to go ahead and put his finger in water on Yom Kippur. Meaning the same way there's an Isser Rechitza, an Isser to bathe, to wash on Yom Kippur, there's also an Isser to do so on Tisha B'Av, which again, the Gemara is understanding in a more global sense that essentially Tisha B'Av mirrors Yom Kippur in every single way. I will say, even though of course you know, they're 2 dramatically different days. Right? Meaning Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur is one of the happiest days. I know it sounds strange to us because we associate fasting with the morning, but Yom Kippur is a Yom Tiv. Yom Kippur is a Yom Tiv. Yom Kippur is the happiest day because it is the day of Slichum Mechila V'Chapara. forgiveness, atonement, cleansing, right, the washing of the slate. Tisha B'Av is all about mourning for destruction. So again, but yet behaviorally, they're very much related. Meisve, in Bein Tisha B'Av, the tiny Sibur, Elish is Asur B'Asiyas Malacha, V'zeh Mutar B'Asiyas Malacha. So the Brisa says there is no distinction between Tisha B'Av and a tiny Sibur, except that a tiny Sibur has an Isser Malacha, and Tisha B'Av is Mutar. The Gemara says, in a place, of course, where they conduct themselves this way. Because remember, as the Mishnah told us, Malacha on Tisha B'Av is totally dependent on Minhag HaMakom. Halachol Divrayim, Zeh v'zeh shavin. So I will say, yet for everything else, the Gemara seems to indicate that Tisha B'Av will be the exact same thing as Yom Kippur. To which the Gemara says, "Ve'ilu gabe tainis tzibur tanya," and yet by tainis tzibur we learned, "Kisha amru aser berechitza lo amru ela kol gufo aval panov yadav v'raglov lo." But say interesting by tainis tzibur, there's a prohibition of rechitza, but the prohibition of rechitza is only full body washing. But if you want to wash your hands, your face, and your feet, that's fine. Yet Rabbi say, interestingly enough, we know that's not the halacha by Tisha B'Av. Amra Papa top of nun hey Tana kuli katani. Ultimately, you're going to see, you're right, the Gemara over here is only focusing on the ways in which Tisha B'Av was more kal, was more lenient, both than Yom Kippur as well as than a tainis tzibur. But again, we'll say it is clear from this Gemara that, remember, the three groups of fasts, we'll call Tisha B'Av, Yom Kippur, tainis tzibur, obviously share a number of similarities, but also share a number of or also possess a number of differences as well. Good. We'll say top of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, second line. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah said, but wherever you go, so Malacha on Tisha B'Av is a facet of Minhag HaMakom. So we'll say, but in every place the Talmid Chacham does not do Malacha on Tisha B'Av. L'meimra. So we'll say, and remember, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said a person should conduct himself like a Talmid Chacham. L'meimra. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel savar lo chashina liyura. Is that to say that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says we are not choshesh for arrogance? Now, Rabbi say the concern over here is as follows. The concern over here is that if a person, let's say I live in a place where they do malacha on Tisha B'Av. Now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying I should conduct myself like a Talmid Chacham and not do malacha. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon says you conduct yourself like a Talmid Chacham, don't do malacha. Doesn't that have the appearance of arrogance? I'm not a Talmid Chacham, so now, but yet I'm behaviorally conducting myself like a Talmid Chacham. Does that not? There's a concept in halacha of mechsi ki yuhura. Don't do things that are not fitting for where you're holding. So I'm not a Talmid Chacham, and yet I'm going to conduct myself like a Talmid Chacham on Tisha B'Av. Does that not have the appearance of arrogance? So the Gemara says, "Rabbanan savri cheshin liyura." So we'll say it appears that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says in general, we're not lo cheshin liyura. We're not worried that things look arrogant. Don't worry about how it looks. In other words, this is just the right thing to do. Whereas the Rabbanan seem to be concerned about having you engage in a Judaic practice that creates an appearance of arrogance. We'll learn just the opposite. What's the great case? This nan chasan amir tzalikros kriyashma laila harishon kore. We'll say if a chasan, technically speaking, a chasan is parted from kriyashma on the night of his wedding. What's the logic? I will say the logic is the Gemara assumes that he is tarud bebias mitzvah. He's going to be preoccupied with the first act of relations, and therefore won't have the requisite kavana, the requisite concentration for shema. So the Gemara says, yet the Mishnah says that if a chassan wants to say shema, he's allowed to do so. Korei, Rabbi Shimon said, that's the Rabbanon. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer lo kol rosa litol as Hashem yitol. Yet Rabbi here's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no. Just because you want to say shema doesn't give you the right to say shema. Chazal said, we know you're not going to have the right kavanah. So if we know you're not going to have the right kavanah, then at the end of the day, you shouldn't say Shema. Shabbos says, interestingly enough, it's just the opposite. So here in our Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying we're not worried about Yura, we're not about arrogance. The Rabbanan say we are. Yet by Shema, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying for the chassan to say Shema, it's arrogant. We're telling you don't have kavanah. You're saying you do have kavanah. That's not correct. Whereas the Rabbanan are saying, no, if you think you could have kavanah, go for it. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan mukhlafas hashita. Rabbi Yochanan said the opinions are reversed. That in fact, again, it's really Rabbi Shimon Gamliel who says that you could say Shema. and the Rabbanon who say that you can't, which would then align it with this Mishnah. Rav Shisha B'rei Dravidi Amar Lo Seifuch. No, don't go ahead and switch the Shitas. The Rabbanon Lo Kashya. Really, it's not a contradiction. Why? Hacha Kevan Dukule Ama Avdi Malacha V'iu Lo Avid Mechsik Yura. Both say, no, the Rabbanon say like this. If you live in a community where everybody does work on Tisha B'Av, and you don't do work, that has the appearance of arrogance. Aval Hasam, but in the case of Shema, Kevan Dukuli Alma Kari V'ihu Nami Kari Lo Mechsik Yura. So you both say, what the Rabbanan say is like this. When is something Mechsik Yura? When you are doing something different than the public. So if everybody's working on Tisha B'Av and you don't work, that's Mechsik Yura. But by the Kriya Shema case, everyone's saying Shema. Everyone's saying Shema. So if everyone's saying Shema and you decide, you're the chassan, you decide to say Shema also, that doesn't have the appearance of arrogance. Conversely, Rab Shimon Gamliel is also not contradicting himself. How so? Hasam hu deba'inan kavana. Va'alan sadi de lo matzi kavani daite mechsik yura. So Rab Shimon will say this. In the Kriya Shema case, Kriya Shema requires kavana. Kriya Shema requires kavana. But we know the chassan doesn't have kavana. He doesn't have kavana. They will say, to be clear, that's not the shtach against the chassan. That is just the reality of life. Right? He doesn't have kavanah, so for him to therefore say Shema, that has the appearance of arrogance. But ultimately, again, here, I'll say, even if I live in a community where everybody works on Tisha B'Av, and I'm not working on Tisha B'Av, that does not have the appearance of arrogance. Why? Amri malachahi delesle. We'll just say, if people don't see me working, they'll just say that what? Silber has no work. He's got no work that day. After all, puk chazi. Go out and look. Kama batlani ika b'shuka. How many people sit around every single day? And I will say, the act of being idle, essentially, the Gemara says, people don't necessarily interpret it as any more than just being idle, right? And therefore, again, it's not the mechsik yihura. So, what I say, interestingly enough, these two different opinions. Now, I'll just say how we pass in halacha l'maisa. Shulchan Aruch passes like Reb Shimon Gamliel that ideally one should not do malacha on Tisha B'Av. If one is able to go and take off from work, one is able to avoid malacha, that is certainly preferable. If not the whole day, at least until after Chatzos. Because remember again, Tisha B'Av, the morning practices lessen, they diminish after Chatzos. So one should try to avoid malacha, but if you can, at least after Chatzos. But I'll say, interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch quotes this halacha, that a chassan is pater from Kriya Shema. But yet, I will say, amazingly enough, there is actually, sadly enough, the Shulchan Aruch passage in Shulchan Aruch says that since today, no one really has requisite kavana anyway by Kriya Shema, a chassan says Shema even on his wedding night. Interesting halacha, sad halacha, but interesting. Mishnah, let's say we go, Chacham say, Bihuda haya oseh malacha ba'arvei Pesachim ad chatzos. So the Chachamim said that in Yehuda, they would do malacha up until Chatzos on Erev Pesach. Ubegalil lo hayu osin kolikar. But in the Galil, they would not do malacha at all on Erev Pesach. Halayla. So we'll say now, this is fascinating. Up until now, we've been speaking about malacha on Erev Pesach regarding pre-Chatzos, post-Chatzos. What about the night before? So we'll say, so just to understand, the night before is the night of Erev Pesach. So let's say Erev Pesach is Thursday, so we've already established that again, different minhagim before Chatzos. After Chatzos is Asr according to everyone as of now. Before Chatzos minhag. What about the night before? So let's say Erev Pesach is Thursday. What about Wednesday night? Are you allowed to do malacha Wednesday night? Halayla Beishamai Osrim or Beisilom Atirim Adanei Tzachama. Beishamai actually says that really malacha becomes asr even the beginning of Erev Pesach at night. The night of Erev Pesach, malacha is asr as well. Beis Hillel says, no, you could do malacha up until Neitzachama, up until sunrise. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Meikara Tana Minhag, Ulbasov Tana Isura. We'll say, the beginning of the Mishnah begins to talk about minhag. Right, custom, right? That ultimately, again, in Yehuda they did malacha. They did malacha before Chatzos. In Galil they didn't do malacha at all, which indicates that it's based on minhag hamakom. But yet, then the end of the Mishnah, when it speaks out the night before, uses lashonos like mutter and aser, which would indicate that we're not talking about minhag, but you're talking about halacha. So which one is it? Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha, har Rabbi Meir, har Rabbi Yehuda. Two different opinions. The Gemara said this sanya, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bi Yehuda hayu asur malacha ba'arvei Pesachim ad chatzos. So Rabbi Yehuda says that ultimately again, in Yehuda, they would do malacha on Erev Pesach up until chatzos. Ubi Galil ina osin kol ikar. But in Galil, they would not do malacha at all. Amar Rabbi Meir, ma raya Yehuda v'Galil akan. So Meir says, I don't understand. Who cares what they do in Yehuda and Galil? In other words, that's what they do in those particular regions. How does that help us? Ela makom shinagu lasos malacha osin, makom shinagu shalo lasos ein osin. But rather, again, it's based on minhag makom. Now the Gemara says, "Midi kamar b'meir min haga mechlad Rabbi Yehuda isura kamar." And we'll say, interestingly enough, from the fact that Rabbi Meir frames it as minhag indicates that his disputant Rabbi Yehuda understands this to be more a matter of Isser. So we'll say this becomes quite fascinating now, because up until now, we've always been assuming that the matter of Malacha on Erev Pesach was simply a matter of minhag. Now the Gemara seems to indicate to us that according to Rabbi Yehuda at least, it seems to be a potential matter of Isser as well. So the Gemara says, V'sara, second wide line of Bosain on Hamad Aleph. V'sava Rabbi Yehuda arba'asar mutar b'asiyas malacha. Now we'll say, does Rabbi Yehuda himself, his personal shita, Rashi points out how we know this, Rabbi Yehuda's shita. Does Rabbi Yehuda himself hold that the 14th, that Erev Pesach is mutar ba'asiyas malacha? Vatanya we learn. About an interesting case. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, hamanachesh b'shlosh shasar. Well, listen to this case. You're weeding your garden on the 13th of Nisan. V'nekra b'yado, and you accidentally pulled up a plant. So you accidentally pulled up a plant. You pulled up a vegetable. So what's the halacha? Shosla b'makom atit, then shosla b'makom hagarir. You could replant it in a place. I'll say tit in this context is wet earth. So you could go ahead and plant it back in wet earth. Vein shosla b'makom hagarir. But you should not replant it in dry earth. Now when do you do that? So the idea Rashi points out over here, if you go ahead and plant it in wet earth, it will once again take root faster. If you plant it in dry earth, it'll take longer to take root again, and time is of the essence, as you'll see in just a moment. So the Gemara says, when is this case occurring? B'shlosh asar, on the 13th. But you can infer from this, B'shlosh asar in, ba'arba asar lo. But on the 14th, you would not be able to do this. So the Gemara says, which it seems to indicate to us why, because on the 14th, there would be an Isser Malacha. To which the Gemara says, fine. Let me say this outside because Rashi points this out. So we'll say the issue over here is, remember, you want this plant. I shouldn't say it's not vegetable. We're going to use grain, because we'll say what's that play over here is as follows. Remember, anything that's been planted since last Pesach is called chadash, right? Chadash becomes permitted with the offering of the Karban HaOmer that is done on the second day of Pesach. But in order for something to be permitted through the Karban HaOmer, I mean for the Chadash produce to become Yashan, it has to have already taken root. So for example, if you plant something new and it has not taken root, even though it's in the ground at the time that the Karban HaOmer has been offered, at the end of the day, it's not mutter. It doesn't become yashan. So in the case over here is, I'm weeding my garden, or I'm weeding my field on the 13th of Nisan. I accidentally pull up grain. So now I need to replant that. So the Gemara says, good, replant it, but replant it in moist soil. Don't replant it in dry soil, because if you replant it in dry soil, it will not take root with enough time, or it will not take root in time to be permitted with the Karban HaOmer. So the Gemara says, let's analyze. So the Gemara says, B'shlosh asar in bar lo. Now obviously this only works, the Gemara is setting this up as a case that occurs on the 13th of Nisan, not the 14th. Now let's analyze. Michti. Shamini Rabbi Yehuda da Amar kol har kavashina koletes l'shloshi yamim shuvena koletes. Now Rabbi Yehuda holds that in general, any planting that doesn't take root within 3 days is not going to take root. Now Rabbi Yehuda, if you hold that the 14th is permitted with malacha, so ultimately again, why isn't it enough time to go and plant it on the 14th? Right? If you replant it on the 14th, then what do you have? You have 14th, 15th, and at least part of the 16th, right? Remember again, we can say miktzas kekulo, part of the day counts as the whole. Va'ikar beisar, v'chamesar, umiktzas shisar. Shabbos, I remember again, the Gemara is operating under the assumption here that Rabbi Yehuda's personal shita is that Erev Pesach is mutar b'malacha. Yet, interestingly enough, we quoted a case over here where you're weeding your field, you accidentally pull out grain. You want to quickly replant it, and now you replant. So the Gemara just Rabbi Yehuda says replant it in wet soil, not in dry soil, so that it takes root in time. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand why. If Rabbi Yehuda, if you hold that malacha is mutar on the 14th. You could frame this case as happening on the 14th as well. You're weeding your field on the 14th, go out, you picked up some grain, replant it, and Rabbi Yehuda owes you 3 days for a plant, for a growth to take root, no problem. You have 14th, 15th, right? 14th Erev Pesach, 15th first day of Pesach, 16th part of the day, that's the day that Karban Omer is offered, and we're good. Amar Rava begalil shanu. Rava said this case is talking about in the Galil, and as we saw already in the Mishnah, in the Galil they don't do malacha at all on Erev Pesach, even before Chatzos. What about the fact that both say you could have the night? In other words, both say, why don't you set this up as a case of where you did the weeding on the 13th, and you realize you uprooted a grain, and you replanted the night of the 13th? So like that again, you have at least the night of the 13th. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes kibei Shammai. Sheshes because we're holding like Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai holds that even the night, ultimately again, of Erev Pesach is going to be Asr. Sorry, the night of the 14th. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi Amar li Olam kibei Hillel. Lefi shein darka shalvani adol menachesh balayla. So we'll say, Rav Ashi says, no, even like Beis Hillel, people don't weed at night. It's just not a common case. Ravinu Amar li Olam Yehuda. We're talking about Yehuda ba'ashrasha chad miktas yom kukula amrinon. Trey miktas kukula lo amrinon. I will say, interestingly enough, when it comes to a plant taking root, we could say miktas yom kikulo, that part of the day counts as the whole on one day, but you can't say ultimately again that it counts as a whole, that miktas yom kikulo for 2 days. So we'll say, so therefore to go ahead and talk about using it on the 14th and the 16th, ultimately, again, would be problematic. I will say, bottom line for our purposes is that halacha l'maisa, the concept of malacha on Erev Pesach before Chatzos, as well as the night before, is going to be minag hamakom. We do not paskin like this stated position of Rabbi Yehuda that it's going to be a matter of Isser, but rather, again, we go with Rabbi Meir's approach that it is absolutely, totally, and fully a discussion regarding minag hamakom. Good. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, we'll say another interesting Gemara or Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says, so listen to this. Rabbi Meir says, any malacha that was begun before the 14th. So we'll say, if you began a malacha before Erev Pesach, Rabbi Meir says you are permitted to finish it on Erev Pesach. But Rabbi Meir says you cannot start a new malacha on the 14th, even if you have the ability to finish it. The Chum say, Gimel umnios osim malachas va'arvei Pesachim ad chatzos. The Chum say that there are three malachas, or three professions, three umnios, not profession, yeah. Craftsmen, right? 3 craftsmen who are permitted to go ahead and work on Erev Pesach. I will say, so what it sounds like the Chum are saying is, remember, Rabbi Meir said, if you started something before Erev Pesach, you could finish it on Erev Pesach. But you can't start any new malacha on Erev Pesach. I will say, remember again, just so the sheet's flow over here. Remember, Rabbi Meir in the previous Mishnah said, malacha on Erev Pesach before Chatzos is totally based on minhag hamakom. Now Rabbi Meir is saying, even if where you live, the minhag hamakom is to do malacha on Erev Pesach, you can't start new malacha. You could finish something that you began beforehand, but you cannot start new malacha. The Chachamim say that there are 3 craftsmen who could operate on Erev Pesach, and even go ahead, it sounds like even go ahead and start new malacha. Who are they? And they can work until Chatzos. Veiloin achayotin, tailors, saparim are barbers, kovsin are launderers. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer, afratson, even shoemakers. So the Gemara says, Ibailu, so we'll see exactly why those individuals are permitted to operate. So Ibailu, so we'll say, let's analyze Rabbi Meir for just a moment. So we'll say, so here's Rabbi Meir said, any malacha you began before the 14th, you could finish on the 14th. However, avalo yaschil ba b'tchila, you can't start anything new. So now the Gemara wants to understand, Rabbi Meir, what type of malacha are you referring to? Ibaylo, the tzorach hamoitan, is Rabbi Meir talking about malacha that is needed for Yom Tiv? That in other words, that if you began something that was needed for Yom Tiv before the 14th, that you could continue that on the 14th. Aval shalol tzorach hamoid, but if you began a malacha, let's say before the 14th, but that malacha was not for Yom Tiv. In other words, suppose you began a project, and I don't need that project is not to serve until after Yom Tiv, maybe afilu migmar namilo, maybe you can't finish that erev Yom Tiv. Or maybe the other possibility is, shol tzorach hamoid tanan. Maybe Rabbi Meir is even talking about, I started malacha on the 13th, that is not for the purpose of Yom Tiv. Avalo, and therefore again, the Mishnah is telling you that I can go ahead and finish it. But if something has to get done for Yom Tiv, maybe I could even begin it on the 13th. Ol Dilma, the other possibility, on the 14th, sorry. Ol Dilma, Bein L'Tzarach HaMoed, Bein Shalosh Tzarach HaMoed, Migmar in Aschulilo. Or maybe Rabbi Meir is just saying in general. Doesn't make a difference whether the malacha is for Yom Tiv, not for malacha, not for Yom Tiv. Ultimately, again, you could go ahead and finish something that has been started on the 13th, but you cannot start anything new. So both say, so what is the shita of Rabbi Meir? So Tashma, avalo yaschel b'tchila b'arba'asar, afilu tziltzil katan, v'afilu safka kitana. So I'll say on the 14th, the Brisa says you can't even start a small project. Even if you're making a small belt, or you're making a hat, a small hat, you can't go ahead and start these on Erev Yom Tiv. Maya afilu, lav afilu, hani dilatzorech hamoed, migmar in aschulelo. We'll say even these items, a belt or a hat, which presumably would be for Yom Tiv, you clearly see that what? If you started it on the 13th or beforehand, you could finish it on Erev Pesach, but you cannot start it on Erev Pesach. Michlal d'shalol l'tzorech migmar nami lo garminon, which would seem to indicate to us, Rabbi, that's something that is not for Yom Tiv purposes. You can't even finish on the 14th. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, maybe not. Lo the olam shlo tzorech migmar nami garminon. Maybe not. Maybe even if you started something on the 13th or beforehand, that's not for the purpose of Yom Tiv. You can finish it up on the 14th. Umaya filu hani. And why does the Brisa include these cases? Hani nami dezutrinin. We'll say these are very small undertakings, very small projects. To make a belt, to make a little hat, these are easy, small projects. I might have thought the Sachadait Chamina has chalasan, zohi gemar melachton, naschil behu nami lechatchila. I would have thought that because these are such small projects, you should even be able to start them on Erev Pesach itself. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon that you can't start it. Tashma, Rabbi Meir says, Kol malacha shilitzorech hamoed, any malacha that is for the purpose of the Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Gomra ba'arba'asar. You are permitted to go ahead and finish it on the 14th. To which the Gemara says, Imasai, when is that true? That you are permitted to go ahead and finish something on the 14th? Imasai, Bizman shehischil ba kodem arba'asar. That's when you began it ultimately again. That's when you began it before the 14th. However, avalo hischil ba kodem arba'asar. But if you did not begin it before the 14th, then ultimately what? I'm sorry. Avalo hischil ba kodem arba'asar. Lo yaschil ba'arba'asar. You cannot begin it on the 14th. Afilu tziltzil katan, afilu safka ketana. So even if it's a small project, so they can be very easily finished. L'tzarech hamoed in, shel tzarech hamoed lo. Ultimately, but you see that according to Rabbi Meir, the license to finish up open projects on Erev Pesach is only what? Projects which have a shaychas to Yom Tiv. But if something has no shaychas to Yom Tiv, you can't go ahead and finish it up on Erev Pesach. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, not necessarily." Hu adin da'afilu shelo l'tzorech nami gamrinon. No, it's possible, Abosai, that any malacha that you began before Erev Pesach can be finished on Erev Pesach, and even if halacha l'maisa, it's not l'tzorech hamoed. But what are we coming to be taught? So we'll say it could very well be that according to Rabbi Meir we say like this. In reality, any project that you began before Erev Pesach, you are permitted to finish on Erev Pesach. Again, before Chatzos. Assuming that you live in a place where they do Malacha before Chatzos. Say if you started at Erev Pesach, you could finish it on Erev Pesach before Chatzos. The Chiddush is that applies to everything. Even something that is a tzorech hamoed, something that is necessary for Yom Tiv, all you have is a license for completion. You're permitted to complete the task, but you are not permitted to start anything new on Erev Pesach, even if what you want to start is what we call it tzorech hamoed, for the benefit or for the purpose or for the usage on Yom Tov itself. Incredible. Tashma, so we're not finished. Tashma, Re'emeir Omer, Kol Malachah Shel Tzorech Hamoed, Gomra Ba'arba Asar. Any malach. So we'll say this seems to be a bit more explicit. So the Brisa says, Rabbi Meir says, any malacha that is for the purpose of the moed, for the purpose of Yom Tiv, you are permitted to go ahead and finish it on Erev Pesach. V'she'ino tzorech hamoed, but if it is not for the purpose of the Yom Tiv, it doesn't have a Yom Tiv purpose, then Asar, ultimately again, you're not allowed to do it on Erev Pesach. Va'osin malacha ba'arvei Pesachim ad chatzos. You can do malacha on Erev Pesach up until midday. B'makom shenagu, only in a place where that's the minhag. However, makom shenagu in, lo nagu lo. So we'll say that's only, so again, going back to the idea that malacha on Erev Pesach in general before Chatzos is dependent on minhag HaMakom. But we'll say, but what do you see from here? Ushma mina, l'tzorach hamoed in, shelo l'tzorach hamoed lo, shma mina. So therefore, we'll say, it turns out that according to Rabbi Meir, the halacha is as follows. According to Rabbi Meir, number one, we'll say this is Rabbi Meir, l'shitaso the whole way through. Number one, Rabbi Meir says, that everyone will agree that malacha after Chatzos on Erev Pesach is Aser. What about malacha before Chatzos? Rabbi Meir will say, minhag HaMakom. Totally dependent on whatever local custom is. Rabbi Meir says in our Mishnah here, that on Erev Pesach, if you have an open project, in other words, if you began something before Erev Yom Tiv, the 13th or before, you are permitted to finish it on Erev Pesach. But says the Gemara, when is that true that you're permitted to finish it on Erev Pesach? Only if the project is what we call Litzorech HaMoed. Only if the project is for use on Yom Tiv. It's for Yom Tiv purposes. But if the project you're working on has no Yom Tiv use, then ultimately, again, even though you began it before Erev Pesach, you may not complete it on Erev Pesach itself. Good. So we'll say the Chacham say that 3 craftsmen are permitted to go ahead and operate on Erev Pesach. Remember again, those were the tailors, the barbers, and the launderers. So says the Gemara, Tana, HaChayotin. Now, this is actually quite fascinating. Let me just say this outside before. Essentially, what we're going to see is these 3 craftsmen have a license to operate on Chalamayid. As we're going to say in general, you can't get your clothing tailored, you can't take a haircut, right? And you can't launder on Chalamayid. But there are exceptions to that rule. So since there are exceptions to that rule, and these individuals can operate technically on Chalamayid under certain circumstances, it will say, Erev Pesach can't be more chamer than Chalamayid. So therefore, since they can operate on Chalamayid, we allow them to operate on Erev Pesach as well. So watch what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, Tana chayotin shekin hedyot tofer kedarka b'chol shamoed. So we'll say, so remember again, an individual, let's say I have a tear in my clothing, I can't take it to a craftsman, but lamaisa, I can go ahead and stitch it up myself on Chalamayid. So since there is a license for someone to stitch up their clothing on Chalamayid, therefore the tailors can operate on Erev Pesach. So the Gemara says, Hasaparin, what about the barber? Vakovsin, first wide line about on Hamad days. Listen to this. If somebody came back, let's say somebody was on a long journey, right? And they came back on Erev Pesach and they didn't have time to get a haircut or to launder the clothing on Erev Pesach, or someone was released from prison. And ultimately he didn't have time. He was released right before Yom Tiv. On Chalamayid, he is permitted to get a haircut. And let's remember again, the prohibition to get a haircut on Chalamayid, or to shave on Chalamayid, was based on Chazal's concern that if we allow you to get a haircut or shave on Chalamayid, you won't properly groom yourself for Yom Tiv. Same thing with laundering clothing. If we're afraid, if you don't do it, if you don't, right, person will say, listen, at the end of the day, I have time on Chalamayid, I'll just do it then. So therefore, when you have situations where people were faced with extenuating circumstances and didn't have the chance to properly groom themselves or to launder their clothing, they are permitted to get a haircut, shave, or launder their clothing. So because these individuals can operate on Chalamayid, obviously in a limited circumstance, therefore Allah Chalamayid, the Chacham say we permit them to go ahead and operate on Erev Yom Tov as well. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Omer Afarat Sonin. Now Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says he included, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, the Chachamim didn't include shoemakers. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says also shoemakers. Listen to this, it's incredible. Shekin oli regala metakin ma'alein b'chol shoy. Rabbi Yosef, listen to this. Shoemakers were definitely open on Chalamayid. Why, Rabbi Yosef? Remember, you had Klal Yisrael converging upon Yerushalayim. There was Aliyah L'Regel. So b'pashtos, somebody lost their soul. S-O-L-E. Right? Somebody went ahead and, so stuff happens. So the shoemakers were definitely open on Chalamayid. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yosef includes them as well. So the Gemara says, why don't the Chachamim include shoemakers in their list? Well, this is very interesting. Mar Savar Lameidin Tchilas Malacha Misof Malacha. Umar Savar Ein Lameidin Tchilas Malacha Misof Malacha. So what I say, interestingly enough, if you look at Rashi says Tchilas Malacha Ratzana Sha'osin Min Ha'alam. So also listen to this. Rabbi Yosef will say like this: since the shoemakers are permitted to repair shoes, ultimately again, so also I want to point out Bizmana Gemara, shoemakers didn't just repair shoes. They also what? They also made shoes. So Rabbi Yosef will say like this: once the shoemaker is permitted to be open on Chalamayid to repair shoes, we also allow him to be open on Erev Pesach to make shoes. So that's what it means. Lemeidin tchilasan misofan. We learn out literally the beginning from the end. Since on Chalamayid they have a license to repair, therefore, again, I'll say Erev Pesach can't be more chamer than Chalamayid. And therefore, again, if they're permitted to be open to repair on Chalamayid, we let them remain open on Erev Pesach until Chatzos to go ahead and make shoes. And the Chum say no, we don't learn that out. Just because they're permitted to be open on Chalamayid to repair, at most you would say that they're permitted to be open on Erev Pesach to repair, but not to go ahead and make brand new shoes. And what's the incredible? Says the Mishnah, Moshiv and Shovchin l'Tarna Golan b'Yodalid. So it's an interesting case. You could put a chicken or eggs underneath a hen. I will say obviously the eggs need to sit underneath a hen in order to ultimately fully develop. So on Erev Pesach, you could put eggs underneath the hen in order for the eggs to mature. The Tarnagola Shabarchan, if a chicken ran away, in other words, it ran away from its eggs, Machzirin Osel and Koma, you could bring it back to its eggs. We also said this ultimate Erev Yom Tov. So remember again, even though we said no malach on Erev Yom Tov, you're permitted to do this. Vim Mesa, and if the hen died, the hen that was sitting on the eggs died, Moshivin Acheres Tachta, you could bring another hen to sit on the eggs. Garfid Machmas Ragle Behem Biyodalad, Umoidim Sakim Salim. We'll say if an animal is in its stable and there's a lot of manure that's there, you can go ahead and remove the manure from underneath the animal on Erev Pesach. On Yom Tov, or really on Chalamayid, not Yom Tov, but on Chalamayid, you don't remove the manure. Instead, what you just do is you shovel it to the side. Molichin Kelim Avin Kelim So Uman. I will say you can go ahead and take utensils and bring home utensils from the home of the craftsman, even though those utensils are not necessary for Yom Tov itself. So it says, we'll say, let's analyze all these cases. Hashta osivi mosvina adorim ibayis. So we'll say, I don't understand. If you tell me that you could put a hen on top of the eggs on Erev Pesach, then certainly what? If the hen runs away, you could bring it back. So why do I need that second case? If you tell me that lechatchila, I could put the eggs underneath the hen or put the hen on top of the eggs, then certainly if the hen runs away, I could bring it back and put it back on the eggs. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, seifas on the cholol shamoy. No, that's second case. That second statement, Rabbi said, that if the hen ran away, you could bring it back, is actually talking about Chalamayid. So Amrav Huna, so we'll say, so remember again, what it's saying is on Chalamayid, if the hen ran away, then ultimately again, you could bring the hen back to put it on top of the eggs. And I will say, just so you appreciate this, Rashi says over here, Becholo Shamoid Kamar, Vachi Kamar, Moshiv and Shovchin Biyodal, V'Tanagolim Shabarach, Becholo Shamoid, Machzirin Osam, Mishum Hefsid Beitsim. The Davra Avad Mutter. Both say, remember again, as much as you're not allowed to do Malach on Chalamayid, you are allowed to engage in malacha for the sake of what we call davar ha'avad. If you are going to go ahead and encounter a significant loss, then we'll discuss about significant and insignificant. But if you're going to encounter a loss, you could do malacha. So Rabbi says, so whereas normal circumstances, I would say that if the hen runs away, you leave it. But again, because if you don't bring back the hen, the eggs are going to be lost, then in other words, they won't mature, you'll lose out on the eggs. Halacha l'maisa, you could bring back the hen on Chalamayid. To which the Gemara qualifies this. Amar Afuna, lo shana ela tok shlosha lemarda. So the katila parach tzimra mine. That's only true if you're getting the hen within 3 days after it's run away. Because apparently if you catch the hen within 3 days, it's still warm. Literally tzimra, lo parach tzimra means the fire, the warmth did not evaporate. So apparently a hen runs away from its eggs, but you catch it within 3 days, it'll once again, the proper lashon over here is brooding. It will once again engage in the brooding process. It'll sit on top of the eggs. However, the achar shlosha shivasa de pasta lebei legamre. And furthermore, again, we're talking about a case where the chicken has already been sitting on the eggs for 3 days. Where if the chicken does not go ahead and come back, the eggs will be lost. But if halacha l'maisa again, the chicken ran away more than 3 days ago, the parach leitzimra mine. But Rabbi say literally again, its warmth is gone, which means it's not going to sit back on top of the eggs again. Or v'toch shlosha shibasa dakati lo psiti bei legamre. Or let's say again, the chicken ran away within 3 days, meaning it has not sat on the eggs for a full 3 days. Where l'maisa again, the eggs will not be fully lost. Lo mahadrina. Under those circumstances, we will not bring back the chicken because Rabbi say apparently that would not be as dramatic of a loss. Rabbi Ami Omer afilu toch shlosha. Rabbi Ami says, no, even if the chicken ran away within the first 3 days after it was sitting in the eggs, we still bring the chicken back. But my community, what are they arguing about? Mar savar lehefsid meruba chashashu, lehefsid muat lo chashashu, umar savar lehefsid muat nami chashashu. Rabbi says the fundamental machlokes is as follows. Let's assume for a moment that there is a license to do malacha on Chalamayid for the sake of saving one from a loss. The shaila is, what type of loss are you permitted to do malacha for? So one opinion says, only for a hefsid meruba, dramatic loss. But for a hefsid muat, a smaller loss, you can't do malacha. Whereas the other opinion says, no, even for a hefsid muat, even for a small loss, ultimately, again, you're permitted to do malacha. Good, Garfin. So remember again, the Mishnah said that on Erev Pesach, you could shovel out the manure from the stable of the animal, but on Chalamai, you don't shovel it out, instead you just shovel it to the side. Says the Gemara, manure that's in the chatzar, you simply move it to the sides. But manure that's in the stable or in the chatzar, you take it out to the garbage dump. So both say it's contradictory. Hagufa kasha. At first you said that any manure that's in the chatzar, you just move it to the side. And then you said that if there's manure in the chatzar, you move it out to the garbage dump. So which one is it? If there's manure in the chatzar, so you move it to the side, or can you move it, or can you remove it to the garbage dump? We'll say 2 different time frames. One is talking about Erev Pesach, one is talking about Chalamayid. On Erev Pesach, you are permitted to remove the manure from the chatzar to the garbage dump. On Chalamayid, you can't remove the manure, but you can move the manure. What can you do? Essentially, you could shovel it to the sides so that it's not occupying the entire space of the chatzar. Rava says, no, hava chalosh shamoid, both are talking about Chalamayid, v'achi kamar. In Nas is chatzar kirefes, Motzino Sola Ashra. I will say rather, so Rava comes along and says they could both be referring to Chalamayid. And even in Chalamayid, if the chatzar became like a stable, right? If the chatzar itself ultimately again became so overrun with manure that it's like a stable, that Einachinami, under those circumstances, you are permitted to go ahead and remove it to the garbage dump, even on Chalamayid. Good. Maulichin Kilim Avim Beso. I'm supposed to remember, the Mishnah said that Allah Chalmaisa, you could take utensils and bring utensils from the base, or from the house of the craftsman, even though you don't need those utensils for the purpose of Yom Tiv. Says the Gemara, Amarat Papa Badiklan Rava. Rava did some research for us. Tanan we learned, Molich Novavin Kilim Beisa Uman. Afapi She'ina L'tzarach Hamoid. Our Mishnah said that you can go ahead and take utensils, and you can bring home utensils from the home of the craftsman on Erev Pesach. Even though I don't need these utensils for the purpose, for Yom Tiv. Or Minu, is that true? The Bryce says, in Mevin Kelim Beis Uman, you're not allowed to bring home utensils from the Beis HaUman. Bepashtos, again, assuming if you don't need it for Yom Tiv. Vim choshesh lahem shema yignavu. But if you're concerned that if you leave them by the Beis Uman, maybe they're going to be stolen. Mifana lechatzer acheres umisha. Right, go ahead and we fine. You can pick them up from the Beis Uman, but don't bring them to your house. Put them in a different chatzer. Mishanina, and we explained lo kash is not a contradiction. Kan bar basar kan b'chol shmoed. They're both two different cases. Our Mishnah is talking about chalamayid. Right? Our Mishnah was, I'm sorry. Our Mishnah was talking about Erev Pesach. So we'll say, what's the halacha on Erev Pesach? On Erev Pesach, you could take whatever you want to the craftsman and bring back to your house anything you want from the craftsman. And this is talking about even utensils that I don't need for Yom Tiv. That's fine. On Chalamayid, Rabbi say, we're not taking stuff to the craftsman and we're not picking stuff up from the craftsman. And if you're afraid that by leaving it at the craftsman's house, it's going to get stolen, that's fine. You could pick it up from the craftsman, but you can't bring it home. You can instead deposit it at a different secure location. The other possibility is both not contradiction. Both say could be. One is the case where you trust the craftsman, and one is the case where you don't trust the craftsman. Tanya, we learned Mevian Kelim Beis Uman Kigon Hakad Beis Hakadad. Here we have a brace that says as follows: you could pick up utensils from the craftsman's home, like for example, a jug from the jug maker, Hakos Beis Hazaga, a glass cup from the glass maker, Avalot Tzemah Beis Hatzava, but you can't pick up wool from the dyer, Velo Kelim Beis Uman, nor utensils from the craftsman. Both say so. In these last two cases of kelim and wool, the assumption is that these utensils have no purpose on Chalamayid. Vim ein lo ma yochal. But Rabbi say, what happens if the craftsman doesn't have any money? So Rabbi say, I want to pay the craftsman because this way again he'll have sufficient means to support himself. No sin lo scharo, pay him. Umanicho etzlo, but leave the utensils by him. But if you don't trust him, the craftsman, leave the utensils by him. Manichin b'bayis hasamachlo. Ultimately, pick up the utensils and deposit them in a different house, not in your own house, but in another house. And if you're concerned, ultimately again that maybe the utensils will get stolen, mevian b'tzina b'soch beiso. You could actually pick it up and you could bring it home and deposit it in your own home. To which the Gemara says, that's fine, but taratzta mevian. You explain the case of picking up utensils, molichin kashya, but going ahead and taking it to the Beis Uman still is contradiction. Diktani ein mevian. Bryce says you're not allowed to bring it to the Beis Uman. V'koshkein de molichin ella mechabarta kidishaninan meikara. Rather, says the Gemara, our initial explanation seems to be clear. Namely, Rabbi say that's what? That is two different cases. Our Mishnah is talking about the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, whereas the Braisa was talking about ultimately again on Pesach itself, or on Chalamayid, I should say. And therefore, Rabbi say two different halachas. When it comes to Erev Pesach, Rabbi say, you could take whatever you want to the Uman, and you could pick anything you want up from the Uman. Whether that utensil is for the purpose of Yom Tiv, not for the purpose of Yom Tiv, it doesn't make any difference, right? Halacha l'maisa on Erev Pesach, again I will say, there's a simple reason for this. Why? Because the act of taking something or picking something up from the Uman is not what? It's not malacha. It's not really malacha, right? And again, when we talk about malacha, we're talking about dynamic activities over here. The act of taking or picking up is not really it. So therefore, again, essentially what the Mishnah is saying is, halacha l'maisa on Erev Pesach, you could pick up or take, you could drop off or pick up whatever you want from the Uman. I will say, now again, we're not getting into the halachas, which are interesting halachas very quickly, about, general, when you drop off an item to be serviced, on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tiv, there are other associated halachas potentially about the Amir L'Nafli. We're not talking about that now. We're just from a malachat context. You could drop off and pick up whatever you want on Erev Pesach. On Chalamayid, there's a whole number set. There's a whole different set of halachas. Right? Both say on Chalamayid, ultimately again, on Chalamayid, potentially, there are certain things you could drop off, certain things you could pick up, but halacha l'maisa, again, you are much more limited. Alright, Rabbi say, again, just to point out, this is not the sugya of Chalamayid. That's why we're not really getting into this right now. But halacha l'maisa, again, our sugya, or our discussion, is really limited, halacha l'maisa, to Erev Pesach. Alright, Rabbi say, Yeshikayach, Ablat Nehaf today, Baruch Hashem, let me just pick up at the Mishnah tomorrow. Say good morning.